Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm here today with Inez. Yeah, we have a bit of news to catch up with this week. I wanted to start with this 538 article which you sent me, which I thought was really, really fascinating. It's by a guy named Michael Tesler, who is a professor. I don't know where now, but he was a few years ahead of me, like a cohort or two ahead of me, or maybe three or four. I don't know. When I was studying PhD at UCLA, so people knew Tesler as somebody who, had been around the department, does a lot of interesting work. These people who do this research on American politics, it's very biased in the sense that they'll basically do surveys where they'll say, what do you think about race issues? And if you have basically Thomas Sowell's view on race, that racism is not holding black people back, they'll say this is racism. And they'll say racism correlates very strongly with being, a Republican, but actually when you take that data, it's correct data. It's actually true, and it does actually get at something. And so sometimes you have to interpret it, and you have to sort of just buyers beware. But the data is useful. This article at 538 is called "Why Trump is Polling Much Better Among Very Conservative Primary Voters Than in 2016." And so basically, the main thing is that in 2016, Trump's worst group was the very conservative voter, and in 2024, right, the very conservative Republican primary voter loves Trump more than anything, right? And this is just so interesting because he finds that basically his argument is that Republican voters have come to sort of define conservatism as loyalty to Trump. He's got some data here, like Liz Cheney, how conservative she's considered falls off a cliff, right, when she opposes Trump. Romney, it's a similar pattern. There's other data from other senators too, near the end of the article. But I thought this was actually fascinating and tells us something about the primary. But you tell me, what did you think of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have like a different. I'll lay out my narrative of how I read this, and then you can give yours, and we can see if there's any overlap slash they're just completely different universes of. I saw this very much as a continuation of Tim Carney's work. I don't know if you remember, but all the way back in 2015, 2016, he was writing about this, and then continuing to write about this huge divide between the Cruz voters in 2016 and the Trump voters in 2016, right? And sociologically, the Trump voters are less church going, more atomized, more likely to come from broken families, right? Also geographically in struggling regions, we know that's the constant political narrative, right, about the Breast Belt and everything else. But he basically put together these two profiles. But then the people who would call themselves very conservative on ideological issues in 2016 or policy issues, but they tended to be more church going, more intact families, higher rates of marriage, right? Higher rates of being a parent, all of these higher rates of civic volunteerism, even, right? So there seemed people who essentially were in these connected communities who were conservative were much, much more likely to go for Cruz in the primary than they were to go for Trump, and vice versa. If you were sort of this atomized, disconnected, and post-religious, you were much more likely to go for Trump. And I think one of the things, and I guess I'm kind of putting myself into this category because I was quite opposed to Trump in 2016 from the right? Like I thought that his policy was not conservative enough, and I was a strong Cruz supporter for that reason. But I think two things have happened since then that have changed those trajectory lines that may not be just the thesis of this article, which is just that very conservative has just become an identity with Trump voters, right? Or with Trump himself. Um, and that is one, going back and reading Carney's book, and some similar research he's done where even recently in 2019, where he's laid out some of these patterns in American life. It struck me how much more I agreed with the Trump voters that he interviewed. Whereas when I read that in 2015 and 2016, I was like, no, these guys are like, they're leftist whiners, right? They're talking about the system being rigged and everything being stacked against them. And I was like, you sound like Bernie voters, where's the sort of up by the bootstraps mentality of conservatism here? And it struck me how much I agreed with them going back and reading it a couple years ago, rereading it and thinking, no, these guys saw something I didn't see, which is the rot in our institutions was so deep. I mean, and it proved itself over and over and over again during Trump's presidency, right? There were all these unprecedented things that these institutions did to try to get rid of Trump that, even though I didn't, initially like Trump, put me very, very strongly in his camp over and over and over again. And I think this is a centrality of Trump's appeal. The best part of his appeal is when he can credibly make the case that a rigged system hates him. And I think a lot more people, especially people who consider themselves very conservative, even on policy, see that very clearly and therefore identify more strongly with Trump than they did when he first started running. But you think this is something else?
No, it's that sort of sounds like you agree with me. You're saying, yeah, I think that basically by 2024, by now, that basically conservatism means loyalty to Trump, and you're saying that basically you saw that people were attacking Trump, and you found yourself on the same side of Trump, and I guess that seems to be what you think is going on with the voters.
Well, so I think the way you put it to me off air was something closer to personal loyalty, and I don't deny that there is that core Trump voter who is very, very attached to Trump as a matter of charisma and personal loyalty. I'm not sure actually that it's that category that's described in this 538 article. I think actually those folks tend to be more moderate on a lot of policy things, or they don't care about policy at all, and they're just in it to watch Trump smack around the left. And that's culturally satisfying for them for all kinds of reasons, right? But I think actually it's backed up by what was it? Anderson, what's her name? What's her first name? The pollster, the Republican pollster who tweeted this article out. Her polling on the same group of people, this self-identified very conservatives, also shows them to be the most open to switching to DeSantis, right? In other words, this group of people and this group of voters very much likes Trump for all the reasons that I just laid out, but is also open to somebody who is willing to sort of hit the system in the same way, in a more like conservative policy minded manner. So I think those are two different groups of people going on. I think actually Trump's hardcore loyalist base would not be calling themselves very conservative on a survey, not very often.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the interesting things they do in this article is they have this thing called the DW nominate score. So this is in political science, is used basically to rank people ideologically, right to left. And the idea is that basically, do they vote on the right wing or the left wing version of every bill? And it's just by, some complicated math where they do it and then they figure it out, right? And so in this, in this, and there's flaws to that. Obviously, it's not perfect. But as far as this goes, they have the DW nominate score on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is show how conservative they're perceived. And so generally, the senators in their own state, the more they vote conservative, the more conservatively they're perceived. But you can see very strongly like that the guys who voted to impeach Trump, like given where they are, like how they actually vote, like Ben Sasse and Pat Toomey, have very standard conservative voting records, but people with the same record, they're perceived as less conservative. And this is presumably because they voted to impeach Trump. Now, maybe this doesn't matter all that much.
So I think the reason that heuristic doesn't map very well onto the divisions of the Republican Party is that it doesn't reflect the long-term divide between the base of the party and leadership votes, right? So I think that's very difficult to suss out, because the fact is that, for example, people who voted for impeachment are more they're more establishment Republicans, all of them. And it doesn't reflect that divide that I think this poll and like the interpretation of these kinds of numbers may reflect. Now, maybe it reflects that identity with Trump, or it reflects that group of people who are more are more conservative in a serious sort of policy way, but also ended up very strongly siding with Trump, both in the general election in 2016, even though they didn't vote for him in the primary, and then even more so throughout his tenure as president. But there's no way to separate out so the people that you're listening, for example. Ben Sasse might be the only exception to this. A lot of the guys who would have a strong quote unquote conservative record, meaning they vote with Republican leadership. That's how you're defining it. I would want to see those numbers rerun, for example, if this is, I don't think, not even around anymore, but they had conservative review rankings, right? And that was much more like policy based. So, for example, how would a survey or a study like the one you're describing rank votes for this this debt deal, right? If you're voting with leadership, you would be more conservative, whereas like somebody like Chip Roy would be ranked as less conservative based on this vote. And that's not it assumes an identity between party leadership voting and where you are conservatively, and I don't think that reflects the division in the Republican Party at all.
Yeah. So, like, to said Sass, but also Pat. I mean, does Pat Toomey? Do you see him as an establishment conservative? And like, they
Fairly
all.
so, yeah. I mean,
And
obviously, there's a spectrum of such things, but yeah, fairly so. Like, my impression of him is that he's a pretty establishment guy.
Is Tim Scott an establishment guy?
Yeah.
Is okay? Well, Tim Scott is a little bit more popular. So like I mean, they all do that. You say they vote with the establishment. They all. I mean, they all take a lot of party
So,
line
so
votes,
then the
right?
question of what would separate, quote unquote, the very conservative group from the general group of Republican voters, to me, would be exactly something like this kind of debt limit fight. Are you more sympathetic with the rebels than you are with McCarthy? Right. And those kinds of distinctions are totally lost. But to me, they're the essence of the thing. And certainly back in 2015, 2016, that was the argument that Ted Cruz was making. He was making it trading on his reputation during the Obamacare debates and everything else of being basically the anti-establishment guy. And he still got rickrolled by Trump. But I think those are two different groups of people who sometimes align and sometimes don't.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just much simpler. I mean, isn't it just much simpler to assume that look, the Republican primary voter is very tribal. They really like Trump, and they don't want anyone criticizing Trump. Like, why is that just like not the easiest thing to believe?
Well, I'll tell you what will separate out who's right on this. And
Mhm.
we can return to it, and I'm open to being wrong on it. But how the attacks that Trump is using right now against DeSantis land will be an indication of which one of us is right. So, in other words, if you see people who identify as very conservative, um, turning against, not like in any like intense way, I don't expect like a mass fallout from Trump. Um, but when Trump says things like Cuomo did a better job on COVID than Ron DeSantis, right? Or when he hits Ron DeSantis for voting against amnesty, how does that group of voters respond to those kinds of attacks with Trump very explicitly hitting DeSantis from the left? Because I think there's a lot of people out there in this category who think that Trump did a good job, think he was totally sunk by the deep state and whatever else, which I think is a view that has a lot of truth to it, by the way. Um, that he would be a good president for round two. They probably think he didn't win. I mean, that he did win this time around, and it was stolen from him. Um, and but at the same time, they don't dislike DeSantis. DeSantis, a lot of them had very positive view of DeSantis because he's enacting the agenda that they want Trump to enact. I don't think that there is this big, like, I think there are a lot of voters who like both, and to the extent that I just think it's very different than the group of people that I think most strongly resembles this article, or the explanation for it, is not the one that they're talking about, but it's a different group of people who are, one, new to politics, usually swing voters, either don't care about policy at all, or have completely contradictory sets of policy ideas, and really are in it for personal loyalty to Trump as a
Yeah.
figure. But I think those are two different groups of voters. I think they both exist, but I don't think they're like the same group of voters. And I don't think those voters are marking themselves very conservative on those surveys.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're just, yeah, you're right. There is some kind of like new voter who didn't think about politics much, who's sort of low information, who just sort of was in it for Trump. I think a lot of like the QAnon people are like this. Some of them even have like leftist backgrounds. They were just they were just anti-vax or some kind of conspiracy theorist. And then they eventually, became Trump supporters. The guy just spoke to them. Do you ever like watch, like, you ever like actually sat down and like watch the Hannity?
Yeah, I mean, regrettably.
Well, there's going to be maybe it'll be out by the time this gets released. But there's going to be a Trump town hall tonight on Hannity, and so I mean I think of this as like pretty much like clearly the Republican primary voter. And when he talks about, or like when he talks about Trump, or when he talks to Trump, and there was a clip I saw with Trump and Mark Levine not that long ago, where it was the same thing. It's like they treat, like, they like DeSantis fine. Like Kennedy, I'm sure, likes DeSantis, but they treat Trump like he's God. And like they don't. I mean, Hannity doesn't care about issues at all. It's just Trump. I mean, it's just like this person was
Hannity's
loyal to
always been
Trump.
well, so Hannity has always been exactly in whatever like the line is, including from Republican leadership.
Exactly. Well,
But
he's
like, oh,
that's
so what I'm saying is the people who are really enthused by Hannity are a different group of people than the people who watched Mark Levin or Glenn Beck, right?
those
Those
are
are
the
two different
Republican
groups of
voters.
people.
What are the
They
Republican?
are. They're all
Yeah.
Republican voters, but that's what we're talking about here, right? they're a different audience. And I'm not saying that the voters you're talking about don't exist. I just don't think they're marking that very conservative bubble. I think that poll reflects a very real shift of people who were initially skeptical of Trump because he came from the left. The whole, like, the people that Cruz was talking to with that New York Democrats line in the primary, right? Um, those are the people who were initially skeptical of Trump and that now at this point have been won over by Trump, both by the way that he has been treated by the system and the left, but also due to actual achievements of his administration, right? Regulatory rollback achievements. The judges were really important. The fact that he followed through on the infamous list, that's really important to this group of voters, right? And those are the voters, to the extent that this is a contest at all, if DeSantis can really get off the ground at all, I think those voters are open to listening to him saying, I will make the things that you liked about Trump happen more and actually execute them. I think those voters are open to that case. It doesn't mean that they don't like Trump. They still like Trump, right?
Yeah.
But in a way that his harder core supporters who are non-ideological, they're not open to that at all. I think he probably has 20 or 30% of the Republican base voters, primary voters, like purely on basis of personality and charisma. But I think there's probably another, I don't know what the numbers are, but like 20 or 30% who are with him because they are conservative. And I think those voters are peelable. I don't know if DeSantis can do it or not, but I don't think that those voters have the same
Yeah.
identity equation between what it is to be conservative and whatever comes out of Trump's mouth at any given moment.
Yeah, I mean, so the voters, are clearly not one thing. There are some who actually care about policy, who, look at DeSantis's record and say, wow, this is pretty incredible. There are people who are just sort of, vegetating in front of the TV and just, following, the FBI scandals around Trump and just love Trump, the person. And there's, a lot of people who are probably in between, right? And it's just a question of a numbers game. How many of each sort of category are in the Republican Party? And you're right. When you say 20, 30%, I mean, are probably unshakable for Trump. I would assume it's more than that. Say it's 30, say it's 35, say it's 40. This is
Well,
the
that's what he won the 20. The reason I pulled that number out is the I think it was like what 32 or 33% that he actually had in the primary.
Yeah, I would assume it would be at least as much as time, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But either way, DeSantis is going to have to consolidate the rest, right? I mean, that's the problem. The problem is, if these people, like, so Trump, would you just do the math? I mean, you just do the math, and like DeSantis has to win. If 30% are in Trump's camp, DeSantis has to win something like 70 or 80% of the rest. And that's with like everyone else in the field, right? He has to beat Trump among that group. He's got to beat everyone else. He's got to grab 80% of the vote. And that's just like, I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I can maybe imagine a scenario where it does, but I'm just very, very skeptical that it will.
Well, I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical that he can do it as well. I think that it's possible, but I think he's doing something that's very difficult, which is he's making the case essentially to people who like Trump that he's going to do the same thing but better, and he's got to change their minds on that front because Trump is the proven quantity to them in that equation, right? And so, what I'm saying is I think that there is a block of these people who are persuadable on that case, whether or not they're a big enough block and whether or not Ron DeSantis can persuade 80% of them or whatever. Those are open questions, and I'm somewhat skeptical that he can. But I don't think that all the people who are currently, for example, polling for Trump right now, I think some percentage of them, if they listen to the case that DeSantis is making, are going to say, well, that's reasonable. Like, I want to hear Trump respond to that, right? Like, how is he going to respond to the fact that the wall has not been built? Like, that's a pretty basic policy position, but it is a policy position. And I think there are a lot of Republican voters who do care about that. What are you going to do about the deep state? Like, concretely, how are you going to get the sort of cultural boot off of our necks? Because DeSantis has a very good example of how he did that in Florida, right? I think there are enough Republican voters who are interested in that case. I don't know if they're enough to make the difference between winning or losing the primary, but I don't think they don't exist. I think there are people like that. A substantial portion of the party is out there.
Yeah, you're right. The wall is sort of a tangible, concrete thing you can point to. He'll say it did exist. He'll say, I have, there's really no limit to how Trump could sort of just create reality, right? He'll say the wall is there, or just it's 90% done, or something like that. And then there's some of these like critiques that Trump makes that are like you think it would be easy to push back, like so when he says like the election was stolen basically in 2020, the obvious question is like, why didn't you do anything about it? And like, why won't they just steal it from you again? Because now you're not president. So like, what's going to happen differently, right? And DeSantis can't say this because DeSantis can't run on the idea that the 2020 election was real, right? Then he would be like a liberal, right? So he's lost sort of like what actually would be a very strong line of attack on Trump. I see them talking a lot about why didn't you fire Fauci? Why didn't you give the country to Fauci? Yeah, that could work. I mean, I would recommend doing that. We'll see. Yeah, I think that that's reasonable. Attack him from the right and attack him on these like personal things, like Fauci, like because Fauci's sort of like personalizing like everything bad that happened during COVID.
He's also making the argument that exactly kind of without getting into so far, and I don't know if I'll be able to, without getting into litigating the amount of fraud in 2020. He has been making the argument. For example, he's been talking to people. There's that video of him in Iowa going around where he said, "Of course, I'm going to be using ballot harvesting. I'm not going to fight with one hand behind my back." Like that's a division. I don't know how that's going to play out in a Republican primary, but like that is part of the argument he's making is I'm going to win this. I'm more serious about all the things that are necessary to fight in a rigged system than Trump is. Whereas Trump, told people not to use mail-in balloting. I'm not only going to tell them to use it, I'm going to like go ahead and use the tactics of the left because that's the playing field that we have in these states. I think that might be a convincing argument to some people.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, I think that could work too. DeSantis can also point to his record in Florida. I mean, they've done some things on voter integrity. He could point to that too. He says, I do more than Trump didn't do anything while he was sitting there as president. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty. I think we can easily predict sort of the things DeSantis is saying and the things DeSantis will say, and it's just a matter of time to see the extent to which they land. I've seen one poll. One national poll since the DeSantis announcement, because the South announcement is a moment you think you might get a bump. The DeSantis announcement, wasn't perceived as going very well, but there's basically no change, right? It's like DeSantis gained a point, Trump dropped a few points, but it's still a 25-30
So
point lead.
I want to see the polls, and this will be interesting. I want to see the polls in maybe a week or two, right? Because DeSantis is now the big difference between DeSantis before his launch and after has not been the launch itself, which clearly did not give him like anything, right? The Spaces Twitter thing did not give him anything. But the big difference is he's now actually directly going after Trump. In a way that he seems like freed now to do it in a way that he was just kind of brushing aside the attacks and saying, whatever, like let's move on to the serious stuff basically and just trying to ignore it. But since he's launched a number of like that thing about the amnesty bill, talking about crime, talking about so he's launched a few direct attacks at Trump now. I don't know whether those will make any difference, but it'd be interesting to see the polls in a couple weeks and see if they do, because he seems to have taken the gloves off now and actually entered the arena in a way that he didn't before the launch. So the launch itself, I don't think made any difference, and he's lucky it didn't, tank him. But yeah, now he seems like fully in the arena, and we'll see if that makes a difference.
Yeah, and I think that nationally, probably a lot of people aren't paying that much attention. But I think he's in Iowa, he's in New Hampshire, he's all over local media there. It'll be interesting to see, if I really want to see some polls from Iowa and New Hampshire. We're not getting a lot of them.
And he needs one or both of those, right? Otherwise, the case for him being able to win collapses, right? Even Ted Cruz won Iowa, right? And Trump went on to win. But he needs some of those early states, and otherwise the case for him collapses completely.
Yeah, Mark Halperin says he needs both. I think he probably needs both, but you're right. He at least needs one. He doesn't know way Trump takes both, and then everyone.
If he takes second place in both of those, he's done, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So if that moves, we'll see. And the hope for DeSantis, so everything has to go right. He has to win one or both. Everyone else has to drop out. It's a game theory. It's a game theory thing because they think if they think Trump is going to be the president or has a good chance of being president, their incentive is to get good with Trump, right? Their incentive is not to sort of throw in with DeSantis. If Trump looks like he's winning, right, they're going to have to do that. At the same time, if they think they can make a difference, but it's too, they've got to coordinate, and this is the problem. And speaking of which, we have Mike Pence entered the race. Do you see a role for Mike Pence sort of in this universe, the Republican primary? Because when I look at it, he does have the name recognition of being a former vice president. He is usually polling around third. What's his role going to be here?
I mean, I think obviously he's going nowhere. I mean, maybe I'm letting my personal feelings get in the way here, but like I've never liked Mike Pence. Even on the core issues that he's supposed to be identified with, evangelical sort of social conservative issues, he's folded so many times. On the RFRA battle as governor of Indiana, he's just always been this sort of talk a good game to the social conservatives and then stab them in the back all the time. He's to that degree, he seems like a slimy politician to me. And I think it's actually very funny that he obviously linked up with Trump to try to launch his own career, but then in January 6th, now he didn't do what Trump wanted. And so now that career is stillborn. I find that to be like sort of some kind of justice in the world in a way, because he so clearly had cynical reasons for doing it to my mind, to begin with. But in any case, I think the one role that he could play, and this goes to what we were just talking about, but I think the one role that he could play is, look, he still has that evangelical identification. To the extent that he has anything in politics, it's that. And if he can, get an 8% in Iowa, that might be play spoiler for Ron DeSantis, right? And similarly, I think in terms of narrowing the field, right? Haley and Scott are now losing badly in South Carolina. Which, I don't see how either one of them continues in the race after that, right? Because that's their home state. And if they come in like third or fourth or fifth in their home state, I don't see how they're going to have the money to continue. Look, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, politics predictions are always like a ridiculous game because what do I know about this? But it seems like they're in through South Carolina and that's it, unless they get some kind of explosion or vote.
Yeah, the Pence as the cipher of evangelical votes from DeSantis is correct. Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Because the abortion is another one of these issues where sort of DeSantis is to the right of Trump, and these even these pro-life organizations are sort of mad at Trump, but sort of they sort of kissed and made up, but they don't trust that he's fully on their side. And I was listening to some interview with him, and he was actually like, he wasn't just like blaming the pro-lifers for screwing up 2022, but he was saying like they didn't show up, they didn't come out. He was just like saying that like they didn't do anything in 2022. I mean, he was really going out of his way to just blame them, which I thought was pretty funny. So yeah, this is
but Trump can turn around and say the opposite thing immediately, and he does have a strong case, which is I overturned Roe v. Wade.
He does have that, but I think they know. I mean, but like I think the pro-lifers, they know, like DeSantis. I don't know. I don't know what's in DeSantis's heart, but I was reading some reporting that suggested by people close to him that this is like not his main issue, right? Like there were people around him who thought it was good for the primary. So I don't know. Like nobody really knows if this is like something DeSantis cares about deeply. Trump people don't think he cares about abortion. I think with Pence, what you have, if you're just like an abortion voter, if you just all you care about is the pro-life issue. You think he's just a slimy politician, but I think he genuinely believes in I think he's an evangelical who genuinely believes that life begins at conception, and that's an important moral issue. He might have cucked, as they say, on the religious freedom stuff. I remember that when he was governor of Indiana, and it was just some freedom of association bill, right? And I think this might have been like the first or one of the first capital strikes where all the corporations said,
yes,
we're going to move out of a state. There was
one, the capital strike.
Yeah, there was a North Carolina. I don't know if this was slightly before or slightly after, but there was a North Carolina trans bathroom bill, and I think that might have been first, and this might have been like second. It was something like that. They were both very early in these days, in the days of corporations doing this. And so yeah, he backed down. But no, I mean, I believe he's has a sincere belief on abortion, and I think that some percentage of voters are probably going to see that, and if that's all you care about, that he might be your guy.
One speaking on of the subject of the Capitol strike and all that, one very satisfying thing about the polls recently to me has been to see Christie Noem at 1%. Um, and she's somebody else who like demonstrated to me that she is wholly inadequate for the era in which we live. Um, in the way that she over the trans in sports issue, which is like the easiest part of that issue, right? About women's sports, where she completely backed down, and she backed down, as Nate Hochman has reported very convincingly, backed down because of pressure from corporations. Completely, doing the normal GOP playbook that has gotten us, I think, very much where we're at. Um, and that absolutely tanked any national hopes that she might have had. She was considered a rising star, potential VP pick for Trump, et cetera, because of COVID and because she was the other governor who did not shut down her state, right? But that one issue tanked her national career. And I think that that's really good in terms of that shows that the Republican voting base, I think, is ahead of the party. Mike Pence also similar rhetoric to Nikki Haley and Christie Noem on this stuff, saying, well, we need to think about the jobs with Disney. I don't think that the government should be going after a private corporation. That was Mike Pence coming in the other day. And then Nikki Haley earlier several weeks ago on Fox. I think the fact that Christie Noem is not even a blip on the national radar now after becoming sort of the rising star for a while is a really good indication that Republican voters do care about that issue, that they're not going to be receptive, for example, to Trump's tax on DeSantis on Disney, which doesn't mean that they won't be receptive to, it's a tax on Ron DeSantis for anything else. But I think it is a good indication that the Republican base understands, along with these Bud Light and Dodgers and Target boycotts. I think the Republican base understands the relationship between cultural leftism and big corporations very, very well and much better than a lot of their elected officials.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know if that's why Christie Noem is sort of not in the. I mean, I think a lot of voters probably don't know who Christie Noem is. I mean, the governor of South Dakota.
She had like huge polls initially. Like there was this moment where all the pieces were written about Christie Noem and how she's the rising star Republican Party. She gave that speech that I thought was not very good in front of the in front of the four faces on in South Dakota, right? Like. Or North Dakota. Is that in South Dakota or North Dakota?
The Rushmore, the four faces.
Yeah, Rushmore.
That's it. That's South Dakota. That's her state.
Dakota, right? Because she's I don't know across which border that is, but but she gave that big speech in front of it. She gave the Republican response. There was a lot of like national energy around her at one point, and then it turned on a dime when this reporting happened, and when she folded to corporate pressure on this issue. Like it tracked almost perfect.
Maybe you're right. Among the people who care about politics and are following it and would need to be boosting someone like Christie Noem. So Pence, spoiler, or maybe what's his goal? What does he want? Like, why is he doing this? He thinks, somebody once told me, somebody was close to politicians, like they do this because they think guy A drops dead from a heart attack, guy B drops dead from a heart attack. That's it. I'm still there. Right. Is that all that's sort of going on here?
All you need is a big ego and one billionaire.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
There's no real downside to running, right?
There is no, well, I mean, there's, you're wasting a year of your life, but you're whatever. I mean, he's on TV, right? I guess like Pence will be on TV. He'll, whatever, go to churches, talk to them, whatever he wants to do with his life. I guess it provides more opportunities. Yeah. I guess the question is, why do more people run for president? You're right. I guess there's no reason not to do it. Okay. So yeah, Noem is Noem going to jump in? Have you seen anything about Chris? I've just not heard anything about her.
I mean,
heard the North Dakota governor is jumping in. Do you hear about this?
No.
It's very exciting. He's like actually announcing. Yeah, that's how exciting it is. His name is North Dakota Governor David Burgum. He's going to self-finance and he's going to run for president. So that's very exciting. But the one I'm actually excited about is Christie. And I think that, we're just all sort of looking back to 2016 and we're all remembering, us people who really like politics are remembering the New Hampshire debate, right? Where he sort of eviscerated Marco Rubio, right? And I think like the wet dream of like the DeSantis cap is like, he gets on the debate stage and then something like this happens. Is that sort of the hope? Is that like sort of the Christie's destiny here if he's able to do anything?
I mean, I it's going to be difficult for him to do that. Not only because Trump is more difficult to torpedo on a debate stage than Marco Rubio, um, but also you have to get Trump on that debate stage to begin with, and Chris Christie has to poll well enough
Yeah.
to get onto that debate stage. So yeah, that seems to be. Look, if all of those things line up, I suspect that you're right, and Chris Christie will spend the entire time just trying to like ruthlessly take down Trump and not caring about his own chances and just a bit of vengeance. Um, that being said, I don't know that there's that large a chance that he'll have that opportunity.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that's it. So yeah, I was thinking of Christie. Yeah, right. Maybe not getting on the debate stage. It's not going to be the easiest thing in the world. I saw we saw the tweet from Kornacki that had him the highest unfavorables of any Republican. So like Republicans know who he is and they tend not to like him, right? So not a lot of people are in that position. That's a very bad position to be in. And so he's got to make the debate stage. And then Trump has to debate. Now, that's interesting. I didn't consider the possibility that Trump just would not. I mean, there have been talks that he might not debate. And it's so funny. This is why people sort of love Trump. They asked him, are you going to debate? He said, oh, maybe if DeSantis catches me in the polls, right? He just tells you like what's going on, right? And so it makes perfect sense. That's exactly, I think, what he's doing, right? If he's 30 points ahead and it never changes and he's just 30 points ahead for like 4 or 5 months from now, like he should just go to Mar-a-Lago and just like eat steaks and like DJ weddings or whatever he does down there. I mean, he'll just have it, right? He shouldn't even do anything. And then but if DeSantis gets close, if it's even within the same universe, I think they're going to have to debate it. Is that the way you see it too? It's just basically if DeSantis has to catch him first and then they'll go on the debate stage.
Yeah, I mean, look, it makes perfect sense from a sort of game theory analysis for him not to do it until he has a reason to. I do think that it's not a good thing. This is something that started with COVID, right? Really, the optionality of debating. We saw it in the Arizona governor's race, for example, where Democrat refused to debate. Obviously, Joe Biden, there were fewer debates and they were very far away, and like it allowed the COVID environment allowed Joe Biden to run from his basement. I do think it's not a good thing for the Republic, to the extent that I mean, that even saying that is sort of laughable, right? But yeah, I think it's a good thing to put these guys on a stage where they're not mediated by headlines and have them speak directly to voters. I would like to see Lincoln Douglas debates come back where we just get rid of the moderators and just let them go at it. Now, that doesn't really work with like 8 people on the stage, but I think it's a good thing. It's a good opportunity to actually speak unmediated to voters, and I think that's
Imagine
what
Trump.
Trump used Twitter for. But we know now that to a larger or lesser extent, all of those social media workarounds around the media, those themselves are now controlled by the same Borg, more or less. Twitter might be the exception; it might not. There's some very frustrating things happening today with that Matt Walsh documentary, "What Is a Woman," which is getting deboosted for quote unquote misgendering.
Although I get an alert whenever Elon tweets, and I just got a tweet from Elon saying being fixed 9 minutes ago. So
Okay.
it sounds like I don't even know the context of the tweet, but I'm assuming it's that.
Yeah, it is that because he had responded before and basically said, "Oh, this is a mistake." So, but nothing had been done the last time I checked. But yeah, hopefully Twitter will remain reasonably free speech based platform. But I think that was the power that Trump had to go on Twitter and sort of totally circumvent the media, where people could just check out the text of what he said. But I think debates serve much the same function. I think they're really important in an more mediated sort of media landscape where the headline and the selective quoting and at this point like AI deepfaking and whatever else creates so much confusion and bias. I think it's a really good thing to have a standard to demand of all candidates to actually stand in front of the American people and debate. That being said, that's like pie in the sky. Like Trump has a good reason not to. Like there's no sort of upside to him debating really with the polls the way they are right now.
I'm very interested that you said that about debates being good for democracy. What do you think about the DeSantis strategy or sort of principle that he doesn't talk to the MSM, so he doesn't talk to NBC or like New York Times or Washington Post? I don't know if they're still doing that. It seems that they are, but they're talking to conservative media or they're just talking through social media. Do you think that's similarly harmful for democracy?
No, because the reason that I felt it's almost like the inversion, as in I think the mediated voices of the media are a huge problem. Like the way that they mediate between what the candidates are actually saying and what people actually receive is a problem. And that's why I favor going to social media, because it was, at least if the tech companies allow it to be, it was a direct format,
Yeah.
right? Where the candidate says XYZ and the voter hears XYZ. Um, so I'm generally in favor of all of those things. And I think it's frustrating that Republican politicians still completely simp for legacy outlets that consistently misrepresent and mislead people about what they said and did. I think that's a problem. And I think if we ever want it to change, you have to start hitting journalists where it hurts, which is access.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of I disagree with this. I think you need to sort of engage the media. I mean, there was a hit piece on me, not a big piece, but like Axios, they did their little bullet points about me at the University of Texas, and look at these tweets of this bad guy. And there's a thing, trying to get rid of me. They can't do anything. But I know the media is bad sometimes. That being said, I mean, they do have an absolutely massive audience. Like strategically, I don't think it's a good idea. Like you can't be fooled into thinking Twitter. Like, okay, I'm going to go directly to the people at on Twitter. Like, you can't be fooled into thinking that that's the entire world. I mean, if you've ever looked at the numbers for like number of people who just watch like the NBC nightly news, like basic TV, not cable, NBC, CBS, ABC nightly news, they're absolutely massive. They're bigger than people's Twitter's accounts. They're bigger than the cable news networks. And the cable news networks, I mean, DeSantis team was trying to pretend like the Twitter launch was such a big deal. And they're like, oh, we had hundreds of thousands, people in there. Like, it would have been smaller than any TV network, much less all of them. They probably would have all covered the DeSantis announcement live. So you would have had CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. You would have had many multiples times of people watching it. And so they do exist. I mean, they're not gonna. The New York Times is not gonna disappear. CBS, they're not gonna disappear. There's good journalists and there are bad journalists who work for these institutions. Call them out when they're unfair, sure, but I don't think this is good from, as you put it, a democracy perspective or from just a pure, self-interest perspective for DeSantis.
So first of all, it's not my position that Twitter can replace the audience of legacy media.
Mm.
But that's why I think the debates are important, right? So whether it's Twitter or any other way, I think more unmediated contact between the people running for office and what they say and the voters is a good thing. That's why I'm in favor of the debates and in favor of them being as little moderated as humanly possible. I think the DeSantis camp position isn't, we never do public events that are then covered by mainstream
Yeah.
networks. The DeSantis position is, or at least this is really a Christina Pushaw position, right? Obviously, DeSantis has endorsed her vision, but I think she's right about this, which is, why are you going to take juicy stories to the New York Times, right? Why are you going to leak to the New York Times or to Washington Post, right?
They're important because they have huge audiences and they
Yeah,
shape the
but
narrative.
what ends up happening inevitably is whatever you think you're getting is this that garbled through this like misleading filter. And the only way to actually punish those outlets for their misleading coverage and sometimes factually incorrect coverage is to punish them for access. It's like this. I mean, I just like the Trump and media game, right, where they're both gaining what they need from the game.
Yeah.
Where media loves to cover Donald Trump in a very like often misleading way, right? But they need him. And the Trump administration leaked consistently to the New York Times and to Washington Post.
Yeah.
And I think Christina has a good point. I think she has, at least in Florida, right? She has managed to get the kind of coverage that she wants. I think it's just different. It's call by call, right? Should you, if you have the opportunity, just sit down in front of the audience and talk directly to the audience the way that Trump did on CNN, and you're pretty confident that you can like go tete-a-tete with whoever they put up against you, I think that's a good opportunity to talk directly to an audience that wasn't listening to you before. But to give a quote or to give a story, right, to some of these legacy outlets guarantees that, first of all, because you can't control what they're writing and you can't control how they manipulate what you said, right? I think it's very different. If you can go on one of these outlets and you get unmediated airtime, I think it's a positive. But
Yeah.
if you give a quote to the New York Times instead of giving it, as a presidential candidate, I don't know, to like the Washington Examiner or whatever it is, I think you are helping these outlets then later smear you.
Yeah. What do you think? So there was a story today that Axios that was about how to pronounce DeSantis's name, and they had like DeSantis saying it different ways, and then they had his wife like saying it another way, like DeSantis or DeSantis. And then they, the end of the story, they're like, we went to the DeSantis campaign and the Never Back Down PAC, and neither would reply about how to pronounce his name. Like, shouldn't they tell the media how to pronounce his name? Don't you need? It's like such a reductio ad absurdum, I think, of the sort of the DeSantis strategy, isn't it?
I mean, I just don't think that matters, right? I don't think it would have been a terrible thing for them to reply, but
Yeah.
I also don't think that it matters. I don't think that they're any better off if they had. These legacy outlets need Republican candidates as much as the other way around, and Republican candidates have been unwilling to cut off access as a negotiating tactic, and I think that that's bad. And then I have the separate argument about as much direct contact between elected officials. And I mean, I like the days of the Jacksonian Republic, right? Where people could just walk up to the White House and yell at the president. Of course, the president was armed back then.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what do you think about the, my impression is, so I remember 2016. I was like, so with 2015, I was sort of like excited, like this was really fun when Trump was running. So I was like watching TV all the time, and Trump was everywhere on every single channel, like Morning Joe. Like he's just sitting, he's like talking to them for like an hour, like he's their buddy, like literally every single morning. I mean, the amount of media time he got was absolutely incredible. And right now he comes back and the first thing he does, right, is CNN. And there's just a sort of spirit of like, I'm not afraid of these people. Like I will go talk to them. He's like, I mean, there's something very like powerful about Trump, like hating the New York Times, calling the fake news. They're trying to put him in jail, but he's like calling Maggie Haberman all day, and they're like sort of best friends or chatting on the phone, right? He just doesn't care. He just doesn't live in this life of like they're gonna. And he's like he gets in trouble like an idiot. I mean, he goes and says things that like hurt him in like legal investigations. I mean, it's really funny, but I mean, this is sort of what Trump is. And so DeSantis, it sort of seems like the energy, it seems like it looks like he doesn't feel like he's confident. Like he couldn't go into a town hall with Caitlin Collins, right, or any CNN reporter and not get rattled.
That's no, he probably will. I think that, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but the Christina Pushaw strategy isn't really about this. It's about when somebody, it's not really about like, oh, if I get the opportunity to do a town hall on CNN, I'm going to turn them down. It's more like, media is some legacy outlet is going to write a hit piece about me, and then they like email me for comment, right? So that they can appear more unbiased by jamming in the candidate's comment in like the 15th paragraph, right? And she just writes back to them and says like, screw you. I know that you've already written the story.
I'm sure if DeSantis wanted to do it, if DeSantis was willing, I mean, I'm sure CNN would love to have a town hall with him. I think it's more than that. I think it's like you literally just won't sit down for me. Like if NBC said, let's have an interview, even a town hall, like, I don't know if they've asked him, but like my understanding is like they're just not talking to the media at all, right? So it's more than just comments on stories.
We'll see. I'd be surprised if he never like, even in a relatively generous format, if he never sits down with them. But the strategy up till now has been more about, giving comment or especially leaking and giving stories, right? So the whole Trump administration leaked like a sieve and almost exclusively to left-wing media. And that brought a lot of prestige and a lot of clicks on left-wing media because they broke a lot of those stories.
Yeah. I think this mentality of we have to punish them. I understand what you're saying. I don't think that this is like, I don't know. Like it doesn't strike me that like maybe individual reporters, you could say, look, Taylor Lorenz, you are so dishonest and so out of your mind that, we're not going to talk to you. But I don't know if it's role of like candidates or conservatives to like punish them by, withholding access. Do they really? I mean, do they? They have enough material to publish, right? They're just gonna. The New York Times will still have articles. The leaks will just come from other Republicans, or they'll come from other campaigns, or they'll come from Democrats, or they'll come from the intelligence community, whatever. I mean, it's not like you're gonna like deprive them and they're not gonna have stories anymore. Like I don't think that that's.
Well, first of all, there are stories and there's stories. There's stories that break important news, and there's stories that don't. I mean, that are essentially like slate opinion pieces, right? I think that there's quite a distinction for the prestige of the paper between those two things. But more fundamentally, I actually think Trump and DeSantis are just going about this in a different way, but I think they're both right in the way they think about it. They're also the way that Newt Gingrich thought about it in 2012, where he became the first candidate to get a huge boost from voters for directly attacking the media. I think it's about recognizing the institutional bankruptcy of a lot of these outlets and the extent to which they don't only have a bias, but they're willing to outright print falsehoods to back up their political beliefs. And I think it's about just recognizing that the emperor has no clothes, that these legacy outlets, you know, don't have not earned for a long time the prestige with which they're treated. And I think Trump does that in a different way. DeSantis does that in a different way. But I think both of them still have that mentality fundamentally. Trump just calls it the failing New York Times. And DeSantis is like, I'm going to deny you something important to you, which is access and stories. And you can, I guess that's the larger debate between the two of them as to which one is more effective, which one is actually able to convince Republican voters, which one will be better for the country. You know, it does go to a central divide between them, but they both have the same mentality, which is these legacy media institutions are not worth are not worth our trust, have not earned our trust. They have in fact squandered any good faith they might have had, not just for conservatives, but for like more than half the country. And that's backed up by all the polls, institutional polls about media. People don't trust media, and especially after COVID. I think that's a very potent argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of legacy media, and I guess this will be our last topic because we don't have much time left. We talked about this article, "The Right is All Wrong About Masculinity," by our old friend David French. Have you read? I've thought about picking up Hawley's book Manhood. Have you looked at it?
I haven't read the book, but I did read the David French article.
Okay, yeah, I read the French article too, and I read
not
it.
because I normally read the failing New York Times or David French, but
you don't need tips on discovering masculine discover your manhood or whatever it's supposed to be in there. Yeah, there was another review on the New York Times that I was like sort of more detailed than the French one. I know people like to hate on David French, but I do think there's something here about the idea that conservatives do whine and they do complain a lot, and the question is, how justified is it? We were going to have a larger discussion on like how angry people are, or how angry they should be, and that's, probably don't have time for that. But maybe we'll just talk about French and Howley sort of as a sort of a start of that conversation. And to go around like saying it's the end of the republic every time you lose the election. I mean, to say that like the country is going to be destroyed. I just don't share. Maybe you should think this is like a reasonable place to sort of be at this point in our history. And look, I think there are things that are very bad going on. I don't think they're as easy as vote Republican instead of Democrat, or have the real conservatives take over and the Republican Party and have the win. I think there are like deep like societal issues, like things like the entitlement spending, things like the culture where it's gone, and the anti-natalist culture. These things that a lot of these things cannot be solved by just Republicans winning within the conservatives winning within the Republican Party, and then Republicans winning elections. And so I think that there needs to be like more stoicism. And I think I sort of agree with David French on this point. But you did not like this article, so please tell me why.
No, I mean, and there's a larger question here that we can talk about, and we promised to talk about last time, about whether it's reasonable to have a doomer perspective on where the country is. I think it is. I think it's a reasonable perspective to have. Now, that doesn't mean that, it's inevitable that like the arc of history of the United States is bending towards disaster or anything like that. But I do think that we're in a very bad position. But first, about this David French article, I mean, the line that just stood out to me as like just obviously wrong. He writes, aside from dominance, a concept with precious few virtuous uses, the other aspects of traditional masculinity the APA cited have important roles to play, right? So the APA defined traditional masculinity and said basically like it's on the whole harmful, and this is part of the jumping point of his review. But he said, so this APA document defined traditional masculinity as marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression. So he even acknowledges that aggression might have an important role to play in society, or virtuous role, but then doesn't doesn't acknowledge that dominance has as well. I mean, at least my definition of dominance would be exercising power over somebody, over
Mm.
another person. And it seems to me that that has a number of obvious uses, both personal and political, that are virtuous. It depends on the relationship between who's exercising the power and who's being having power exercised against them, and for what purpose. Right? It seems very much in line with those other qualities, which is to say that physical aggression can obviously be used for just purposes or unjust purposes, right? And that he would just throw away. It seems to me on this like very sort of wishy-washy liberal tick that he seems to have, that dominance is bad, right?
Mm.
We can't
Yeah.
think that there are virtuous purposes. I mean, one obvious one might be attracting women, but but there are other ones, right? Like any legitimately hierarchical relationship has an element of dominance in it.
Yeah.
So does he think there are no legitimate hierarchical relationships in society, or such relationships can never be virtuous?
Do you think maybe you have French derangement syndrome? Because I see what I know exactly what you're saying. And I agree with you, but like you can interpret this line. He didn't elaborate on this, so this wasn't like a thing he went to. But
That's what actually drove me crazy, though, because it was like so obvious to him that this was the case that he just threw it away in a line without even bothering to make an argument for it.
well, when I read it, I wasn't like I just assumed that what he meant was like dominance is like the word like just belittling people or hurting people or trying to control them. That's what I thought. But when you put it like the way you put it, like okay, any hierarchy has dominance. Like okay, that makes sense to me, and that sounds right. But maybe French just he didn't think about it that clearly, right? You could see how he like could write that and it could be defensible, right? Because that's the way I read it.
Well, I think that the assumption, it reflects something about his larger mentality, right? Which
French
is
derangement
that
syndrome.
there
Yes.
there are like these bad things about. He has a certain view of the right as like full of these very bad people with very bad impulses, and doesn't even bother to sort of check that gut impulse, to the extent that he writes something that is flatly not just not true about our society, but like has never been true in any civilization on Earth, right? Unless you think that literally every human civilization of all time had no virtue whatsoever. Um, that is the essence of the problem I have with him. It's like he is putting his former credentials to work, on behalf of knee-jerk liberal impulses for knee-jerk claps from the same people. And I find that just to be a project not worth engaging with in any serious way.
Yeah, I think this is about This is about David French. So if you've never heard of David French and you just read this article, you don't think you might
Nothing
have been
mine would
able to.
stood out to me. I think there were parts of the article that I agreed with about stoicism. I do think that there's a certain virtue in stoicism, but then again, this returns to the question of how justified are people in complaining, and maybe this is a good sort of way to close the
Yeah,
conversation in a way, because it goes back to this question of rereading what Trump voters had to say in 2015 and thinking that it sounds a lot more reasonable after the last 5 years about the system being rigged against them, about a lot of this stuff sounds very non-stoic. It sounds whiny, and that's how
yeah,
it came off to me initially. It was like, this is the sort of mentality that we rightly deride, when the left, for example, talks about Black poverty.
yeah,
Um, that there's no room for individual agency in the way that you're talking about this, or individual character or virtue. It's all like the forces of the world are acting on you. Now the question is, how true is that? Because
yeah,
if it's substantially true in important ways, then it's not why be stoic to point it out and fight back against it. But if it is, then this is why I just disagree with David French, right? He just takes it for granted that it is, that their concerns don't have any merit, that in fact, the world isn't rigged against poor white kids from Appalachia. And it's very unclear to me that that's the case these days.
yeah, yeah. There's so much there. Yeah, we try to keep these things an hour though, and we promise you, listeners, we will get to how angry should conservatives be, and maybe we'll do. Do you would you? I've been thinking about reading actually Hawley's book, maybe even writing something about it. Would you be interested in possibly reading Hawley's book?
Yeah, I'll read it.
Let's
I
go.
like Josh Hawley, and I
Okay,
think it's an interesting subject. I do think he could have chose a better title. There's
man.
just too many jokes that can be made about. But
I'm holding Josh Hawley's manhood. Yeah,
Yeah,
very
right.
mature. Yes.
But no, generally, I think Senator Hawley has said some very interesting things about this subject in particular that are worth taking seriously. So yeah, I'm down to read it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, until next time, everyone.